Okay, I don't know if that was recording, but right now I'm just talking a bit about why the idea of supply and demand is completely bogus and how this misunderstanding leads to tons of wasted resources and lost opportunities, inefficiency. So, once we know what we should be doing, what we want to do, we're pretty efficient at doing that in our modern society. We're pretty effective logistically and operationally once we understand what we want to do, but we aren't. The mechanisms of allocating resources and making decisions are very obscure in our society, right? Yeah, because they're mediated by these marketplaces. So, yeah, basically the issue with supply and demand is it presents these the process of price as only happening at the point of sale, when in reality price is something like everything that happens in a society, in an environment, will affect price. So price is always going to be created relative to our notions of ownership and control of resources. So price is fundamentally a political phenomenon around, like, it's heavily influenced by politics. It's not exclusively a political phenomenon, but it's based on value in the context of politics and social dynamics. So something, yeah. But so when you hear, most people's notion of what supply and demand means is not what economists mean by it. And this is because the common notion of supply and demand is you have it's just exclusively production and consumption. So you have a certain amount being produced, a certain amount consumed. If more of the stuff is consumed than is produced, then the price will go up. If more is produced than is consumed, the price will go down. But that's not actually what the supply and demand model says. So the supply and demand model has price curves for both producers and consumers. So it's not merely that it's getting overproduced. It's the price at which producers are willing to sell and the price at which consumers are willing to buy. So in that sense, it's a tautology. It's something true by definition. It's just a self-referential statement. So supply and demand says the market price is just the balance of what producers are willing to pay and what are willing to sell for and what consumers are willing to pay. It's not actually a balance of production and consumption. You have to include that price component. And that's lost on a lot of people. Now, furthermore, this concept is presented as production and consumption. The words supply and demand sound very synonymous with producing and consuming, but that's not actually the case, is it? We try to apply supply and demand to things like traded stocks, which there is no physical production of a financial asset. You just have a total valuation for the financial entity, and then that gets divided by the number of shares. So, but the thing is, stocks actually demonstrate this notion of intersecting price curves, but it's not because things are being produced and consumed. And like, economists don't generally bother distinguishing between whether something is getting produced and consumed, how durable it is, and whether it can recirculate and such, whether it's like a real thing or just a financial asset. Like most of our notions, GDP, fail to make these distinctions. They fail to distinguish between some individual maintaining their bicycle. They can't measure that. So economists are heavily biased toward what they can measure. And they can only measure things when an accounting activity takes place. When you do actions without an accounting activity taking place, they can't measure that. So, and governments can't measure it as well. They can't really tax it so much very easily. But anyway, so with the traded stock price, you actually do have the intersection of price curves, but they're bid and ask curves. They aren't supply and demand. So a bid is an offer to buy a stock, and an ask is an offer to sell a stock. So the market price will always be the intersection of bid curves and ask curves. So if you want to look at how price curves work, go look at some stock market depth charts. Okay, so depth charts perfectly demonstrate what economists were trying to do with the supply and demand model. But the notion of supply and demand as determining the market price is completely bunk. The price will determine how these price curves diverge, okay? So a bid curve is always will be more bids at a lower price below the market price, and an ask curve there will be more asks above the market price. As you go further away from the market price, there'll be more asks. But this is a circular feedback process. Like, people observe the market price, then they set their own price. It's not that the internal assessment of okay, the supply and demand model, it makes it look as if your internal objective assessment of costs is setting a price at which you are able to offer something. So the supply and demand curve, it assumes that it costs more to produce more product. But this actually generally completely contradicts the notion of economies of scale. So the idea behind economies of scale is that when you produce one unit, you have some fixed costs and marginal costs. So the fixed costs apply whether you produce 1 unit of product or 1,000,000 units. And the marginal costs are your costs to produce one more unit. Now, based on economies of scale, if you produce a lot, it's cheaper to produce that a lot. So this notion that suppliers will charge more to produce 1,000,000 units than they would 100,000, that falls flat on its face because of this notion of economies of scale of fixed and marginal costs. Okay, so right there, like, there's a million other examples like this that show the notion of supply and demand as a causal relationship of determining market price is complete bunk. So the reason why price curves exist is because observers note the market price, and then they are strategically responding to that market price to try to get the best value. Now, price is due to costs, benefits, and political control. So those are the three things: cost, benefits, politics. That's everything behind price. And I'll get more into what markets are and how they work. Let's do that right now, actually. So a market, so when you look at animals, there are many social structures among animals. There's herds, where animals will group together for safety in numbers. And generally, animals in herds are vegetarians. They eat plants. They generally are able to secure resources easily, but have a harder time protecting themselves. So they group together for protection in a herd. Okay? Now, so this cooperation exists because everyone can secure resources easily, but they can't protect themselves easily. Now, with the pack, the opposite is true. With a pack, usually predators form into packs, and they do so to better hunt prey. Whereas they would have a hard time chasing down an animal themselves. If a bunch of them are able to move in unison, they can tactically, strategically do that. Now, packs have a much more hierarchical structure. So you have these two alternative social structures of packs and herds. Now you see that in human society, in politics developing. Now herds have a maximum size before they break down, and this is why socialism often fails, because the herd mentality is just one of passive protection. It's just being together for strength in numbers, and there's nothing wrong with this per se. It's a strategy, but it's a strategy that makes you dependent. Okay, but the market is unlike anything else we have in nature. People cooperate based on not social hierarchy and not just protection in numbers. In a marketplace, people cooperate based on productive efficiency of coordination in large-scale systems. So there's a certain amount of political independence that's required there, but also a minimum amount of integration. So it's like a balance between these two mentalities of a pack and herd. You need both the elements of protection in numbers, where people respect property rights as such, and you're able to enforce laws because it's just easier for people to respect laws. So if you don't have a marketplace, people will just take your stuff. They won't bother trading for it. So all the political structure that goes into creating this marketplace is going to determine who controls the resources, what they have to do to control them, all these factors. Now, if you don't have a marketplace, if you don't have this form of limited social cooperation, there's no supply and demand, there's no price, nothing exists. Even though there could potentially be producers and consumers, you need some type of political balance. Now within that, price is going to be determined by the costs of production, the benefits, and political resource control. Okay? Now obviously, costs are not congruent to everyone, and this is where you get this notion of supply and demand. Because the costs are not congruent to everyone, you'll have some suppliers and some demanders, and then they'll be able to exchange. But that's a very limited view, in my opinion, behind the factors of price. So basically, price just is negotiated between the costs and the benefits, and it has these dynamic processes, but there's no strict anchors to price. These curves, the only reason why you get trading at all is because the cost and benefit structure is different among different parties. And I suppose the supply and demand model is intended to reflect that, but they never adequately explain that. They never adequately explain why exchange isn't occurring at all within a biological system. And the result of that is we end up living more animalistically, whereas animals, they aren't able to plan and coordinate. They just live day to day in their environments. And to the extent we fail to appreciate how these processes actually get resolved through politics, through maintaining a certain political neutrality. That's what allows a market to flourish. So prices are political, and a regulation like supply and demand, far from being like that's not manipulating the price negotiation. That is part of the price negotiation, because you need this political environment for exchange to happen. Okay, so something like minimum wages, that's part of the price negotiation. It's not an independent external force on it. It's part of the process of pricing things. Okay, now sometimes some of those processes can be less effective or have lag, or generally the more political process is, the better it is at representing everyone's interests in the very long term. But the worse it is at being coherent. You get the difference between packs and herds. It's less efficient, but it's better. But sometimes you don't want to be efficient at something you don't want to have happen. So when you need basic protection, you're going to go with more of the political strategy. When you need independence, when you're very goal oriented, you're going to want to lean more to the market strategy. Okay, so that's it.